Welcome to the second lecture for chapter 20, and in this one I'm going to be going over the social and the economic sections of the chapter. So we're looking at section 2. So you see here a couple of images, and one is going to represent some of the economic developments and the other picture of the church, which unfortunately caught fire last year and has largely been heavily damaged. That's Notre Dame in Paris. But that represents some of the social developments we'll talk about. So I have your spice chart out, and we're going to focus now on the economics. And then after I talk about economics, I will talk about the social developments. So again, focus your notes: types of economic systems, labor systems, technology, industry, trade, commerce, money, things like that, of that nature are going to go in economics. Okay? And again, try to take one or two notes on slides. So there will be about 15 slides after this. So like elsewhere in China and in the Islamic world, the economic growth that Europe experiences in the High Middle Ages is going to be fueled by the expansion of agriculture and arable land. So this is a big cornerstone of economic development everywhere. You cannot have a thriving economy without an adequate food supply. So in Europe, we begin to see the expansion of arable land as nobles, who were the people that owned a lot of land, begin to see the value. Instead of using the land as hunting for hunting and game like they used to, they saw the value in cultivating it because it provided them with more wealth and more taxes. And so having that higher tax yield encouraged the nobles to open up more lands for farming. But there was other developments that were significant, and it has to do with the improvement of agricultural techniques. And one of those agricultural techniques was the invention of the heavy plow. The heavy plow is an iron plow, but it has to be pulled by animals that are strong enough and not going to get hurt by pulling it. And what that does is it allows you to break up soil in order for you to farm. It allows you to break up soil that is hard. And Northern Europe, where it's colder and they have colder climate, has much harder soil. So areas that previously were not really farmable now are able to be cultivated because of the heavy plow. And another practice that was significant is the three-field system, where you would grow crops on different farms. You would rotate the different types of crops, and you would grow, for example, beans that put a lot more nutrients back in the soil on one field, wheat in another field, and your third field would lie fallow, which means you don't grow anything, but your animals, they poop on there, and that helps put nutrients back into the soil. And the following year, you're going to rotate it. So that's called crop rotation. And so you see the image there with the different fields that are being used. And that way, one particular crop doesn't always exhaust the land. If it exhausts the land for a year, the following year you put something else there to replenish the land, or you let it lie fallow. And all of that is going to increase agriculture. We also see more use of water mills, right, alongside running water in canals and rivers. These water mills allow you to mill the grain and turn it into flour so you can make bread. Other technologies and tools included, besides the heavy plow, are the horse collar and the horseshoe. So outfitting these onto horses allowed horses to replace oxen. And horses they work a lot faster, and you could put them in teams and they could pull the heavy plow. So those technologies, like we saw elsewhere in the world that we've been studying, allowed for more land to be cultivated. And Europeans began to better understand how to farm. They began to print manuals and explain how to make a horseshoe and what to use it for. So all of this increased people's knowledge of farming and allowed them to improve their techniques. We also see the introduction of new crops, right? So it isn't just about more food, it's also the quality of food and the quality of your diet. So between 1000 and 1300, you're going to see more meat and dairy products, fish, vegetables, and others added into the European diet. Some of these are going to be thanks to the spread of Islam and the development of Islamic kingdoms. If you recall in chapter 14, and there's a map here to show you, that when Muslims conquered and built their empire, they built it from east to west. And that's significant because the latitude doesn't change. And climate is dependent on latitude. So crops that grew on the banks of the Indus River in India are going to be able to grow on the banks of the Nile, right? And they're going to be able to grow in southern Italy. And so you're going to see the introduction, especially in Spain and Italy, of crops that were spread by the expansion of Islamic empires. So types of wheat, rice, spinach, artichokes, eggplant, lemons, limes, like you see pictured here, right, are all products of this. If you think about like even today, like Italian dishes like eggplant parmesan, or even like risotto, which is a type of rice, or in Spain, paella, which is also based on rice, right? Rice came from Asia, but through the diffusion by Muslim empires makes its way to Europe. And so now cultivating uh, more of these crops allows for a better diet, and then the population is going to rise. Okay, so it goes from about 29 million around the year 800 to 79 million by 1300. And you could see here, right, there was an increase in population, and then the Black Death is going to interrupt it. You could see between the mid 1300s and 1400s, right, a rapid decline because of the Black Death, the bubonic plague. But as soon as the plague ran its course, what you see again is a rapid recovery. Look at how rapid the population grew after the recovery between 1400 and 1550, right? So after the plague had kind of run its course, you're going to see this growth once again, and then it's going to continue to grow, and we're going to talk about that other growth in a few chapters from now. So this population growth then fuels urbanization and the rise of cities that become important as trade centers. So cities that were already, small Roman trading cities like Paris, Cologne, Copenhagen, they continue to grow. Venice continues to grow, and then even cities out further like Novgorod on the Baltic Sea are going to see a population growth, and the cities are going to lead to the transformation of European society as well. One of the big economic activities that takes place is the production of textiles, especially woolen textiles. Europe becomes a coveted destination for woolen textiles, and people outside of Europe are going to want these textiles, so it's going to help them trade with the outside world as well. A lot of women devoted their employment to weaving and sewing, etc., and then dyeing of fabrics. Mediterranean trade is going to grow. So we're going to see a lot of growth on the Mediterranean. This is going to be the hot spot during the Middle Ages. This is going to be the place that's going to experience the most economic activity. And that's because of its proximity to the Byzantine Empire and to the Islamic empires, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Caliphate of Cordoba. And so cities on the Italian coast, like Venice, like Pisa, like Genoa, they're going to begin to grow. And they're going to begin to thrive as they trade actively in the Mediterranean. So anybody throughout the rest of Europe that wanted goods that came from China, that came from India, that came from the Muslim world, they had to trade with the Italians. So this trade went through Italy, and then from Italy it went to Europe. So that's going to be significant. Later we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth. But long story short, you've heard about Christopher Columbus seeking new routes to Asia. Christopher Columbus was Italian, but the reason he went and sailed with Spain is because the Italians were not interested in his voyages, because the Italians already had a good setup for trade. It was the Portuguese and the Spaniards who wanted to kind of take some of this trade from the Muslims and from the Italians that wanted a new route to India. So that's where the role of Columbus's voyages a few hundred years after this is going to be significant. And then in the north, in the Baltic Sea, you want to become familiar with the map, and I say this over and over every time I show you a map, I think every chapter, but you really need to know geography. This is Northern Europe, and here we have the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. The North Sea is the one on the west, the sea, and you could see, if you look very closely on the lower left-hand corner, you see the city of London, and then it connects across the English Channel to the city of Bruges. And that city you see right there pictured, that is the city of Bruges. So that's the North Sea. And then the Baltic Sea is the other sea where you see towards the top right hand. And here, towns all along Northern Europe created a league, the League of Hansa, or the Hanseatic League. And through this league, they were able to establish norms for trading. They were able to establish rules. And being a member of this league gave you benefit for trade. It protected you from invasions. It protected you from fraud. So being part of the League of Hansa was a little trade network that allowed for the growth of trade in Northern Europe. Okay, so you want to be familiar with the Hanseatic League. And so they dominated trade in grain and fish and furs that came from Northern Europe. And another factor in the growth of trade is improved business techniques. So like we saw in China with paper money and flying cash, and like we saw in Dar al-Islam with checks, we see the development of banking and letters of credit and new forms of business organization that allows for trade to grow. A letter of credit, like you see pictured here, is a letter written by a banker that tells you how much credit you have in their bank. So you take this to one of the cities instead of carrying bullion, which is like bags or trunks full of coins and gold, or cash, where it's a lot more risky of getting robbed on the road. Carrying letters of credit allowed you to arrive to a destination and exchange that letter for local currency or for goods. And so you start to see the rise of powerful banking institutions. This is on the Italian coast, you're going to see the rise of powerful banking families like the Medici family later on. So these improved business techniques then significantly improved trade. Merchants began to form partnerships to limit the amount of risk they take. And so all of this is going to further stimulate the European economy. And it's happening, the same thing that you saw happen in China and the Islamic world, it's just happening a little bit later in Europe. Now looking socially, okay, so now we're looking at focus on the social structures. Medieval Europe, dating back to the days after the fall of Rome, had three main social classes, what they call the three estates. The first estate was the church, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate were the commoners. Those who pray, those who fight, and those who work that you see pictured there. You see a priest, you see a knight, and then you see a peasant farmer. So this was the social system, right? The soldiers, they came from the ranks of the nobility, and nobility people inherited their ranks, their titles. They enjoyed more privileges. The first estate and the second estate enjoyed more privileges. The third estate, the commoners, did not. And so, for example, the first estate was, if they ever committed a crime or they got into illegal trouble, they were tried by the church. So within, they kind of decided their own punishment, which often wasn't much punishment to begin with. Right? So you also see the doors open up to corruption as well. But the commoners, they're the ones that did most of the work. The nobility lived off of the work of the commoners. They lived off of the surplus agriculture on the lands that they owned and that they inherited. You also see then a growing importance in behavior. And another social development is the development of the code of chivalry, as some nobles saw it as important to model proper behavior, not just to take advantage of the fact that you're rich, but to encourage warriors to become cultivated leaders, to become informed and literate. This is a quote-unquote high-class society, right? You start seeing ceremonies like knighting of someone, and like you see there, fair play, nobility, valor, honor, courtesy, and then of course women also promoted these values. So chivalry, that's where we get this, when you talk about like guys opening the door, right? That we call that chivalrous. And that's from the French word for horse, right? And in Spanish, caballerismo, caballo, right? A horse, caballerismo is chivalry. In cities, we also see the formation of guilds. In fact, a lot of, last names you may have heard in like, English last names like the Taylors or Cooper or Millers, right? People got their name by the type of job they had. Okay, these were the guilds, and they had symbols. And so when you went into a city, they would often have these types of symbols as you entered the town square to let you know what types of services that town offers or what kind of goods. You also see a picture there with a bunch of different designs, and those are guild markings. So guilds were organization of workers, of merchants in the towns, and they would set their own rules. And the goal was to encourage economic development within each other. So, for example, they often could set the price of goods, right? So that they all compete fairly instead of one person taking advantage and driving everyone else out of business. So they would form guilds to control this type of activity. They specified techniques, right? They wanted to say, hey, if you buy a sword or if you buy a pot that comes from our country, we want it to be known as a very high quality product so people want to buy it. We don't want to be known as having things that break and fall apart. So they would set standards for production and how you should make things, right? So that it can be guaranteed a quality, and that's what those guild markings are. You knew if you had a guild marking that it was approved by a guild, which means it followed a certain technique. If it didn't have that guild marking, it could be a cheap knockoff that was not made as good of a quality. So you could kind of see those. I would say like name brands, but really that's not the case today because name brands are all about marketing. I could get a $5 T-shirt and put an iron on that says Supreme and sell it to some fool for $70 because they think they're better than me. But back then it actually referred to quality. So guilds were very significant because not only did they help with the economic activity, this provided a type of city life that you didn't see in the rural areas. It was its own infrastructure, and it made possible the thriving of medieval cities. And then lastly, we'll look at women. And urban women begin to experience more opportunities than rural women. Women that lived in the countryside, they continued to do what they had been doing traditionally, which was working with domestic animals, weaving, taking care of the household. But in cities, women began to gain more opportunities. They often worked alongside men as, like your book said, in butchers and brewers and bakers and fishmongers, keepers at inns, launderers, money changers, merchants, physicians, sometimes pharmacists. Sometimes women had their own guilds. Oftentimes women were part of the same guild as men. So all of these economic opportunities, you can see the picture there of the women, working with metal, right? These illustrate the opportunities that existed and why towns and cities became important agents of social change during the Middle Ages, because it starts to lead to different opportunities for women. So just to reflect, economically, what was different during the Middle Ages, during the High Middle Ages, and that is Europe is significantly more economically active. And you should know that the reason for that economic activity is because of the improvements in agriculture. So be able to make that connection. All right. So in the next presentation, I'll go over the next two sections. All right. I'll see you at the next presentation.